Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to episode 3 of the Future Forward podcast. Welcome, Reza.
Thanks, Shay. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I can't believe it's episode 3 already.
I
It's too
know.
much fun.
We're having a blast.
I know, I know.
Like we just talked about right before the show. We liken this to jazz. We have a little loose outline.
Yeah.
We know the sections that we're going to talk about, and there's a little bit of improvisation, but we're just having a blast doing it, and hope that everyone else is enjoying it with us. And keep sending your feedback. We love hearing from
Yes.
y'all.
We do, we do. As some of you who might be listening for the third time know, and those of you starting with us, this is a Future Forward podcast about the future of cities. And every episode, we pick one important aspect of cities to talk about. For today, we have picked the future of built spaces. And as the typical format is, we'll talk about how we got here now and what we think will be the future. How does that
Cool.
sound, Reza?
That's great. Let's jump into it. So, Shay, take us back a little bit. Like let's start with the built environment in the past. Like, where did that begin? It's, I think, a story of civilization here. So let's
It
start with
is. It
that.
literally is. Yeah. The some of what we've learned so far is that Egypt is one of the
Hmm.
places where it all started. And the interesting thing about the built space is that a lot of the things we're seeing today started back then. Ancient Egypt, the Greek and Roman architecture always made use of some of the things we now call green.
What? Really?
They did. It was kind of amazing. And interestingly, when I was researching this, I realized it shouldn't surprise me that much. And I'll share a really quick story here.
Hmm.
I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. My dad grew up in a village called Ijan. It was about 5 hours from Lagos. And he had a grand aunt that took care of him a lot. He was an only child. He had his parents, but he had this grand aunt who was just sort of like the matriarch of the family. And so my dad moved from the village, went to the UK, came back and built a home for his own mom, built a home for himself in the village, and also built a home for his grand aunt. The wild thing, though, is my grand aunt requested that he not tear down her old hut. She had a hut. It was thatched roof, high windows, where the heat would, I guess, dissipate.
Hmm.
And the hut was made of mud, so it retained heat when she needed heat, but retained the cool weather. And how she did that, kept the doors or the windows open. It was just this healthy space that
Mm.
was literally what had been getting built in those villages in ancient Egypt, Greek. And I'll put up some pictures for those who watch the YouTube videos of how the architecture, thick mud brick or stone walls, small windows, overhanging roofs so that you could stand outside on what we
Shade.
call a porch now, you know?
Yeah.
It's been that way all along.
Interesting. They were almost doing green building before green building became sort of a concept, but it was a way to create a habitable structure given the sort of the climate context or the area, the physical environment they were in.
That they were in, yeah. And they did all this without the mechanical systems that we use today. So we
Huh.
replicate those, making a space habitable
Yeah.
with HVAC systems, no, they literally engineered out of materials
Yeah.
spaces that allowed them to live fulfilled
Yeah.
lives and healthy lives for the most part. Yeah.
Interesting. So what changed, Shay? Like, clearly there was a way that we knew how to build and live
Yeah.
in healthy spaces and, using the materials and existing technology. Something seems to have shifted to where we don't quite have that.
That anymore. And I don't know. I think a lot of this probably ties to some of the industrialization and the need to build en masse.
Okay.
There's no real like if that we can point
Mm-hmm.
to beyond
Mm-hmm.
the fact that we started moving away from some of those methods and ended up with homes, sewage systems, lighting that all relied on either mass utilization of resources in
Mm,
cities and inability to purge the homes of those things, which led to just the great stink of
mm-hmm.
England at some point.
Yes.
So, more people in smaller built spaces where those non mechanical methods
Mm,
stopped being applicable. And so we
yeah.
came up with mechanical approaches to put more light in the building,
Mm,
expand the spaces, foundations that allowed us to build over a bigger space so we could put more people in those spaces, which meant the ventilation systems of old couldn't work anymore. So
mm.
I don't think there was a real shift. It was more just this gradual march towards industrialization and needing to pack more people into more spaces.
So it's almost like, with industrialization, there was greater density. With greater density, some of these old technologies, these old sort of ways of doing it didn't quite work at the scale that it needed to in these cities that we were building. We didn't adapt. We couldn't adapt. We couldn't adapt the high window or the shaded, overhang roof into a dense city that is built for as is built for more people being in there.
Yes. And
And all these systems that are needed, the infrastructure that we talked about last time.
exactly.
Yeah.
And a big part of it was for those spaces, we needed to use more resources
Mm,
and we relied a lot on fossil fuels.
yeah.
And consequently, burning whatever energy source we needed to burn, in some cases, oil, because we had oil lamps at some point. We had
Yeah.
stoves that we powered with oil. And we'll have to fast forward a little bit here because we know a bunch of periods between early civilizations and the early 1900s, and then about 1970 when we started to say, hey, we're damaging the planet
Mm,
and the oil embargo. And this is around when the green building movement really started to kick in again.
interesting.
In the early 1970s, the first Earth Day, which was in a wild way tied to a lot of these other environmental movements that made us start to look at the spaces we lived in, because we
Yeah.
had one of the great fires that was related to oil and water in the
Mm,
Cuyahoga River here in the
mm,
US.
yeah.
We had a lot of fossil fuel, OPEC related problems across the world. And even as these vast systems were starting to quote unquote break,
Yeah.
the first thing we turned back to was, man, our spaces aren't serving us well anymore,
Yeah.
which is the whole point of the green building movement. And that was an offshoot of some of these bigger macro
Got it.
systemic problems that we were really starting to worry about.
Interesting. It took that shock to make that shift. I'm curious to hear a little bit about green building. I used to work at an energy efficiency company. Um, uh, and so pretty familiar with all this, but like, take us into this sort of green building standards and some of these things that came about.
Yeah, so the 1970s is really when we started to get all green. It's maybe the
Yeah.
all green again. Um,
Yeah.
and if I remember correctly, some of the work of the building research establishment and environmental assessment method, which was this, hey, how do we design our offices to be habitable spaces?
Yeah.
Back to the office. Remember, the office
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
when we started to put people in, from the first episode, when we started to put people, a lot of people in these standardized spaces. That work started in the 1980s, but really culminated in laws and regulations starting to kick in 1990. And then the US Green Building Council sort of took some of the work from um, the BREEAM approach, and we ended up with the leadership in energy and environmental design, the LEED standard we all now know, which
Yeah.
came really, the regulations came in 1998. And then in the 2000s is when California always sort of leaps ahead when it
Yeah.
comes to things like this. And they put up the California Green Building Standards Code, which is when we started to codify this whole, this is how we build sustainable spaces, homes for people to live healthy, fulfilled lives. But there was a lot that was not working with those approaches back then that we can dive into. But
Yeah.
the codification of this green building idea was sort of between 1990 and the early 2000s.
Interesting. And so, yeah, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about these standards because I have this impression that the standards, you know, somewhat forgot the humans at the center of them. And this is where I feel that you depersonalize or dehumanize, uh, a physical space by creating standards that have to be followed for reasons that the builder doesn't quite understand. They don't feel like any of that is motivating them to build for humans. It's just motivating them to, I don't know, get some incentive or some, LEED bronze badge or silver badge or what have you. So talk a little bit about this, about these standards, and I'm going to poke some holes as you do it.
Yeah, no. So you're highlighting a really big problem with when we start to try to standardize and incentivize the development of needs, infrastructure, or cater to people in cities. In this case, it's in built spaces, but you are correct. A lot of the standards, even LEED standards and some of the BREEAM standards, didn't factor in some of the foundational requirements that we're now starting to pay a little bit more attention to under this healthy building approach. And the healthy building approach is really, it comes out of the Chan Policy Center from Harvard, and
Yeah.
a few things that we missed with things like the green standard. So I'll use an example. The LEED standard talked about sustainable use of water in buildings, but not much was mentioned about the quality of the water, for example. Like,
That's a
who
big
does
miss.
that? Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
big miss. But when you're thinking about the inputs, the sustainable utilization of the inputs and the outputs, which is
Yeah.
buildings, you miss the nuance of the human experience in
Hmm.
those buildings,
Yeah.
is maybe the point you're making here.
Yeah. 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 I think, I'll sort of pull in a thread from my prior experience of, working at a company that helped run energy efficiency programs for utilities. And so, some of this was driven by these, green standards. Some of it was driven by utilities wanting to sort of reduce energy use. But the incentives were all wrong. Like the reason for doing, these types of energy efficiency things weren't about the humans. It was more about, utilities trying to please their regulators
Yeah.
and doing these energy efficiency programs, which kind of contravene their key goals, which is like, we know how to generate energy, we don't know how to save energy. So it's just like, it was opposed. So it was constantly having to go to regulators to prove that they were doing something with energy efficiency, while at the same
Yes.
time, all they knew how to do was generate power. And so you end up with situations where, if you're following standards in these buildings, some of it is done for the wrong reason. And I think this is
Absolutely.
an example of how, misaligned incentives can, lead to these unintended consequences of, not actually getting what we wanted out of like this built environment that is a healthy space, like, what your grandmother had, because
Yeah.
the incentives were aligned there about, creating a
Clearly.
space. Yeah.
Clearly. And again, I'm not knocking. I 100% agree with you, Reza. I'm not knocking that we tried to codify or standardize some approaches to making these built spaces work. What we lost, which I love that you always help pull this out in our conversations. What we lost was the fact that at the end of the day, this was really about the people in those spaces.
Mhm, mhm,
And it's why I like the healthy building approach. And there's a book, I believe Joseph Allen is the
mhm.
professor at Harvard who's done a lot of the work here. And the approach just points to nine foundations, nine
Hmm.
foundations for what makes a healthy building. And I'll list them off here.
Sure.
Um, Good ventilation, so
Okay.
humidity and ventilation in a space, the lighting in the space, and the views that the people in the space get to experience. Because you don't want to, it is not a healthy building if you're sitting in front of a window that is facing a wall. That is
Mm,
not a
mm,
healthy space. Noise in the space is a big part of it. Water quality, which was missed
yeah.
in the old standards,
Yeah.
safety and security, dusts and pests. I mean the
Mhm.
absence of dust and pests, moisture in the space, thermal health. Hey, is it too cold? Is it too hot? And finally, the quality of the air in the space. So
Got
those
it.
are nine foundations of a healthy building, and they touch on things that were missed in many of the standards that we had before.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so do you think that, so this is really interesting because, like, I'll just pull one thread out of there. It seemed like when we were going through COVID, we were reminded of healthy spaces, inside. I remember,
Yes.
like, my office writing to us and saying, "Hey, we're doing all these things to ensure that we have ventilation and things like that." So that became very prominent, like, focused on.
Yes.
I haven't heard the same focus since, obviously not, because we're not like in the
Unfortunately,
midst of a pandemic.
yeah.
But I'm curious, like, given these standards, like, how are they being adopted or evangelized? We like, what's the path here?
Yeah. So I'm an optimistic realist, and the optimist side of me believes that the momentum that was gained, because so I mentioned the healthy building movement sort of started around 2017, and
Mm,
it was really accelerated during COVID because you're correct.
interesting.
A
Yeah.
lot of the considerations, hey, what is the air quality in here? Because remember, during COVID, we had all these ideas about how the virus was being spread. Some
Yeah.
of them wrong, some of them correct, but there was no doubt that air quality or the air we breathe was a method of transmission. Nobody doubted
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually distinctly remember, um, I don't know if it was during COVID or right after the heavy days of COVID. Joseph Allen ended up on 60 Minutes, the TV
Mm-hmm.
show that seems to announce a new thing, trend,
Yeah.
person,
Yeah.
or idea. And he was on there talking about these nine things
Hmm.
and how excited he was about the fact that we now have no choice but
Hmm.
to pay attention to the collective
Yeah.
um, list of foundational healthy building needs. I go to the office a few times a week,
Yeah.
and I like to think the office space, which is a new one, the one I'm in, was built since COVID.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know if we've paid as much attention, not in that space particularly, but there are a few office buildings around where my office is. And it's almost like we just went right back to what we were doing before, Reza,
Hmm.
which
Why do you think?
which
I have a
um
theory.
I'd love to
Um,
hear it. I'd love
yeah.
to hear it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the like in my day job and the work that I do, I'm software in the construction domain, and the big challenge in construction is you have these different stakeholders that have different interests. You have the owner or developer of that property. You have the general contractor that's responsible for the contract and building it, and you have trades that are specialty and doing the specific things like the mechanical system, the electrical, the plumbing, the envelope, the steel, etc. And all of them are bound together by contract,
Mm.
and they're all different. So every construction project, is what you can say new because it's
Mm-hmm.
not been built before,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a new location, it's a new configuration, it's a new design. Very few things are exactly the same
In construction, yes,
in
yes.
construction, and so there isn't an incentive to the designer who works for the owner, and I forgot to mention them. That's the fourth stakeholder here, the designer and
Mm-hmm.
engineer. They might have a desire to create a healthy space,
Mm.
but for the owner, it might be too expensive to
Mm.
apply those standards.
Yeah.
For the general contractor, it might be new ways of building that add risk to the project that they don't want to
Mm.
take on, because it's
Mm.
a special type of building process or form that they haven't done before, creates too much risk and they don't want to take that risk. And so
Yeah.
they're not aligned in thinking about a healthy space together,
Yeah.
no matter what the architect would want to do. And
Yeah.
unless you have an owner that really believes in it and cares about it and wants to spend the money or put that in the contract for the contractor to actually go and do, so you don't get the result of these standards. And the lead standard is an example of like, these were promulgated but didn't realize what
The
you would hope.
potential.
They
Yeah.
forgot the human.
Yeah.
And I believe the stakeholder, or the one that cares the most about the humans, are the architects, but they have the
Yeah.
least power in this whole situation.
It is true. It is true. I agree, and I think some of the approaches that need to, and I'll jump into the future. 100%
Yeah.
agree with you,
Yeah.
and jump into the future, because one of the things that's starting to get spoken about a little bit more is, I'll say, an improvement of the lead standard that is
Hmm.
called the well standard.
Hmm.
And the idea with the well standard is, let us almost like bring in the people who will dwell in those spaces into the number of stakeholders that you've just mentioned. So the four
Hmm.
stakeholders, the well standard is attempting to put the people, that the
Interesting.
people you always mention and you care
Yeah.
about, as a fifth stakeholder, because they will be the ones who will use the space post
Yes.
construction. I'm excited about the well standard. That's really the point for me, because it is being acknowledged and adapted by some of the companies that are trying to build spaces with the individual in mind,
Hmm.
sustainably as well.
And so is like, it's great that there's this standard. I love, the person, the people that will be in that building are the center of it. How do you think that will become more adapted and adopted?
Yeah.
Do you, always the optimist,
I'm
optimistic
the
realist.
optimist.
So,
I'm
so where do you see, like, what's the benefit to these stakeholders to apply that? Maybe I
yeah.
should ask it
So
that way.
no, it's a good way to frame it. And if I take what you just shared about the stakeholders and what they care about and what they're paying attention to, fundamentally, there's this consideration for how much will it cost and how much will I make? And
Mm,
can that delta between those two numbers make sense for me to do this as a business?
yeah.
That's I think
Yes.
the consideration that stops some of these
Yes.
additional foundational needs of the dwellers being taken into consideration. The way I see the well standard becoming a standard is in how some of these innovative new companies are using technology, new materials, and a
Mm,
recognition of the adaptable needs or the
mm,
adaptable nature of how we live in these spaces to implement the world standard. So I'll use an example.
yeah.
There's a company called Bumblebee Spaces,
Yeah.
and it is small spaces that are configured and modular, and it shifts and changes depending on the need of the individual living in the space without losing the air quality, ventilation requirements, temperature requirements. They factor all these things even as the space shifts and changes to
Mm,
allow you to either work, play, or live in some of these
mm,
spaces. So that's one example. Another example that I see is getting a lot more traction is this company that you've probably heard of here in Austin. It is Icon.
mhm.
They 3D print
Yes.
the
Yeah.
homes, and I once listened in on a webinar, a small sort of private webinar that the founder of Icon came to speak on, and he used all the right words. He
Mm,
That it's about spaces for people to live healthy, fulfilled lives.
yeah.
And on their side, they are taking on the work of making sure the materials, the cost,
Mhm.
allow them to build sustainably, both for the planet, but also
Yeah.
as a business concern. So I do think we're hitting a point where we don't have enough homes, for example. We have
Yeah.
to adapt the offices to a certain extent as
Yeah.
we engage with companies in our cities like Bumblebee Spaces that can be used to adapt these offices that we were saying are empty,
Yeah.
and Icon is building residential homes, factoring all these in, we start to shift the conversation a little bit from just
Interesting.
standards for standards' sake.
Yeah. Interesting. So it's almost to sort of tie it back to your grandmother. Like there was a a rudimentary technology for how to build
Yep,
that had the human at the center of the space. We
yep.
kind of lost that story for all these years, and now we're applying our technology today, whether it's 3D printing or you know, um, digital twins and
Sensors
modeling,
for adapting.
sensors.
Yeah,
Yeah, all of that is being applied to bring the human back into it, but at the scale that we're trying to continue to build cities. So we went through this phase of unhealthy type of building, and we're trying to
yeah,
swing into this healthier, remembering all these old things that we used to do but with new technology applied to it, which is
absolutely.
like exactly what this show is about, right?
Lit-
How can technology uh, help us with the challenges that we face in cities, and the angle that I'm always trying to bring, like you're always trying to sort of bring that optimistic view of the future, and I'm always trying to bring like what happened historically and how
the
is the human still at
learnings.
the center of it. And it
Yeah,
seems we have found a pattern, a new way that could allow for those things to be together.
I agree.
Um,
I agree.
yeah,
It's because what you're pointing out is that we as humans never really, our needs never really change.
no, yeah,
What we need to keep at the front of our minds is how can we use the technology, new, advanced, to
mhm,
continue to meet those needs and not just
yeah,
lose or ignore the needs of people in cities at the
yeah.
altar of, oh, this technology will make us a lot more money today, for example.
That's great, Shay. This is good. This is a really good discussion.
Same, I agree. And I love your perspective of making sure community is always at the center because
Yes,
we shouldn't forget that. And what is possible in the future.
yeah, which is
Yeah,
what you do a great job of bringing in.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Do we have any mailbag comments this week, Reza?
Uh, well, so don't have a mailbag comment, but I have a piece of learning that I wanted to bring back to the show. Since we talked last week, about infrastructure and decentralization, disaggregation, sort of going out from sort of the centralized notions of infrastructure that we have. And I pushed back on, whether that's good and whether that's the right thing, would it actually work? And synchronicity this past week, Ben Thompson, who has the Stratechery newsletter, great tech analyst, he interviewed Casey Casey Handler. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right. Casey Handler of Terraform Industries, and Terraform Industries is what they're building is they're trying to build a decentralized way of creating power in a carbon neutral way. So they use solar power to turn water through a chemical process into methane or natural gas. So you're basically, instead of sort of drilling a hole in the ground and bringing up natural gas, you can use solar power to create natural gas, in a carbon neutral way, and do it using this equipment all sits in two shipping containers, so it could be next to the place that needs that power. So say next to a
A
manufacturing
data
plant or a,
center, or
a
yeah,
data center or um, you know, I don't
a
know,
hospital.
a
Pick
hospital, a
yeah,
community, whatever.
yeah.
Um, and I thought that was interesting. I'm not an expert on, the chemical processes that they use or the way that they do it, but it's an example of new thinking on ways to create infrastructure that is decentralized. That's pretty unique. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's different. And he also on this podcast talked a lot about solar power and the creation of batteries and how the costs of solar power are going down to where in a certain amount of years solar power will be the cheapest form of energy,
Yeah.
and battery chemistry and technology will also become cheap. And this is a great thing, Shay, because you talk about this all the time, sort of the anti-fragile nature of, if you have batteries on the grid, you create resilience because
Yes.
they're the fastest way to avoid, sort of blackout
And
situations, faster
outages.
than any of those peaker natural
Yep.
gas power plants.
Yep.
Um, and so it was a fascinating learning that I wanted to share, with our
With the
audience,
audience.
and bring
I
it back.
I really think this leads us to dive in deeper into energy in our next episode. What do you think, Reza?
Cool. I'd love to. I think this
Let's do
is,
that.
yeah, it's a thread that we need to pull. We need to sort
Yeah.
of infrastructure. We sort of talked about it broadly, but I feel like we need to get into energy. This is such a
Yeah.
huge topic, and this little piece of learning kind of inspired me. And I think you and I talked about it, and we are like, you were thinking about energy, and I was thinking about this thing, and so we have a great topic for
It
next
needs
time.
to happen. So that
Yeah.
will be the next episode, which will get to you, our listeners. As always, please reach out, share your comments, share your feedback, share any new knowledge you might have that
Yes.
informs us and improves the quality of what we deliver to you. But
Yeah.
I'll say thank you, Reza. Until next time.
Yeah, thank you, Shay. Love that we're learning. Love that our audience is learning with us. I hope they can share with us so that we learn with them. Excited for what we're doing with our community, future
Yes.
forward listeners. And until next time,
Bye.
we'll say goodbye.
Thank you.